Virginia Tech is 2-0 and heading to visit an old foe in Morgantown, while UVA, also unbeaten, aims to keep its streak going against North Carolina in Chapel Hill. All that, injuries hit the ACC, and Aaron McFarling's puppy Chow, this week on Teel and Barber. Welcome in to episode 58 of Teel and Barber, the Richmond Times-Dispatch and Richmond.com's Virginia Tech, UVA, and ACC sports podcast. I'm Mike Barber, ACC beat writer for the paper, and joining me here, as always, my co-host, the 13-time Sports Writer of the Year and the Virginia Sports Hall of Famer, Mr. David Teel. David, how are you, sir?
Good afternoon, Mike. Welcome to Rivalry Week.
Yeah, it should be a good one on both sides. And, I feel like every week we've got something we're looking forward to. But this one does have a little extra juice. And it got me thinking because we got some fairly inflammatory bulletin board material from a UVA player this week. We'll get into that later in the show. But it did get me thinking about, in all your time in this business, what's some of the best smack talk you've heard or bulletin board material? What jumps out to you?
Well, this will be a little different, Mike, but I think it's such a unique story and probably one that our listeners aren't aware of that I'll share it. Back in the 1980s, this is before Virginia had ever defeated Clemson. The Cavaliers' first win in that rivalry didn't come until 1990. Danny Ford, the then Clemson coach, convinced his players before their home game against UVA, that the Cavaliers had champagne in the locker room and were going to celebrate after beating Clemson. And so after the game, which the Tigers won, all the players we're talking to said, yeah, Coach Ford told us they had champagne in the locker room and no way we were going to let that happen. And I'm thinking to myself, you knuckleheads fell for that? I mean, it was one of the great coaching con jobs of all time. But to hear the players talk, they bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Well, and bulletin board material doesn't really matter where it came from or if it's real, right? If it fires you up, it had its desired effect. This was before my time, and maybe one day we'll have John O'Connor come by and tell this story. But when I was covering James Madison for the Harrisonburg paper, and they played Richmond, they always told the story of and you probably know this, of the pudding game, where during the week, a player from one of the sides, and I can't remember now which team was which, but a player from one of the sides had said the opposing defense was soft like pudding. You'd go through them like pudding. They're soft like pudding was the quote. And when that team ended up inevitably just destroying the team that had alleged they were a soft dessert, they celebrated with Jell-O pudding cups in the locker room, smashing them, eating them, throwing them all over. So it is funny because the same coaches who will tell you in one breath that bulletin board material is overrated and that stuff is out by the time you kick off, they're the same ones that if they find a juicy little tidbit, they're going to be throwing it in every locker and on that bulletin board. So I'm curious, David, what do you think in your time doing this? Does it matter? Does it have an impact on games?
Occasionally, perhaps. I think in the big picture, the more accurate answer is no, especially in football, simply because there are so few games. You have so few opportunities to suit up and go play. If you need manufactured motivation, you might have a problem.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I always go back and forth on it. And here's where I've ended up landing. Coaches in college football are going to find something to prod their team with all week. If you say nothing as the opponent, it's going to be, hey, this team beat us last year. If you say nothing all week, it's going to be, yeah, you won the game, but you gave up 300 rushing yards. College coaches are going to find a way to light a fire under their guys. Maybe you make it a little easy if you go out and say something you shouldn't. That's one of those where it's like, okay, we served it up on a tee for them. But really, at the end of the day, these coaches are going to find something to light a fire under their guys' butts. And I don't know if it matters if you give them bulletin board material. They're going to find something to push their team through the week. Now, looking at a team that really should need no no extra motivation this week, Virginia Tech, and they're going to visit an old kind of longtime rival. It's not an annual rival anymore because they're no longer in that old Big East. But David, what comes to mind when you think about Virginia Tech playing West Virginia?
Well, the first thing is 1999. I mean, that's the easy and the obvious answer, and it's the correct answer, by the way, because here the Hokies are. They're undefeated. They are in the national championship hunt, and all of a sudden, deep into the fourth quarter, they find themselves behind against a very pedestrian Mountaineer team. And the place is losing its collective mind. And here comes that redshirt freshman quarterback, number 7, Michael Vick. And the pump fake and the run down the sideline and the field goal at the gun, and just amazing, as clutch a 2-minute drive as you'll ever see. And the Hokies go on to finish undefeated and play Florida State in the national championship game. But there are others.
Saver.
Pardon?
A season saver.
Oh, absolutely. But you can go back a decade earlier, 1989. The Hokies beat number 9 West Virginia in Morgantown. It was the highest ranked team Virginia Tech had ever defeated. It was the first ranked team the Hokies had defeated under Frank Beamer.
That's and I think what adds to it, and the history and the games, but what adds to it is Morgantown is and I'm going to put this in air quotes, it's a special place to play a football game. And I had been warned that, I was, I guess, a sophomore at Rutgers, and we were heading down to cover a Rutgers West Virginia game, and some of the veteran players were telling me, "Oh, you've never seen anything like it," and I thought, okay, it could be loud. Certainly, I've seen loud stadiums, and it could be energetic. And we were, I guess, in the tunnel where the team was coming out, because in college you do a little of everything. And I think I was taking some photos, and somebody got hit by a AA battery coming out of the stands, and it hit off the player's helmet and ricocheted back. And a friend of mine, another photographer, actually caught it and kind of showed it to me. And I said, "Oh, look at that! It is a different kind of place to play a state game." I remember pulling up, and my first time there was a sign that said, "Welcome to Mountaineer Field. Please leave firearms in the parking lot." And I thought to myself, this isn't a parking lot that I want to spend a lot of time in if that's a sign that needs to go up. But that atmosphere is special, and I think, David, there's something about Morgantown and Blacksburg, right? They're both kind of remote, little rural, right? And there's not another show in town in Morgantown. There's not another show in town in Blacksburg. And you can say what you want about what you prefer in terms of where you'd want to live or hang out, but there's something special about those places where, hey, it's WVU football on Saturday, it's Virginia Tech football on Saturday, and there isn't much else going on. I think that adds something to it.
Sure does, without question. And Mike, we'll talk a little later in the pod about conference realignment. But since Virginia Tech left the Big East to go to the ACC back in 2004, leaving West Virginia behind, there's some resentment. The Mountaineers are thinking, why couldn't we be in the ACC? And you can make the case that they would fit quite nicely. They don't make business sense, which is why they are not in the ACC. But in terms of the Virginia Tech rivalry and the backyard brawl against Pitt, and quality football and quality men's basketball with Bob Huggins, there's a lot of assets to that athletic department. And though they landed in the Big 12 eventually, there's still some hurt feelings.
No doubt. And David, I said this to you during the week. I guess we were texting, and it feels like in the current climate, Virginia Tech would have a hard time moving into the Big East or the ACC, that kind of a move, because it's not in a major TV market. It doesn't bring a tremendous revenue spike, and that's exactly what's held back West Virginia. So in that regard, I mean, Virginia Tech pretty lucky and cagey and smart to have made their moves when they did.
They were, and they had they had considerable help from some
Yeah.
state politicians and some movers and shakers at UVA of all places. That's
Mhm.
that's a long story that could be its own podcast. Trust
Yeah,
me.
stick to sports. Don't get into politics. But yeah, that's maybe a special episode of the greatest UVA to Virginia Tech assist of all time. David, let's get back onto the field, and the Hokies obviously a huge opening win. Some question, okay, how would they follow it up? A little bit of a shaky first half, I thought, with Middle Tennessee State, but they finish off with a convincing victory. What did you take away from the MTSU game?
Yeah, business as usual. Yeah, it was a shaky first half and Burmeister went down, so you had that scare. But eventually, this is a 35-7 game until Middle Tennessee tacks on a touchdown, with 30 seconds to go?
Right.
Something like
Yeah.
that, against the reserve defense. So I give the Hokies a lot of credit. Showed some maturity, didn't let all the praise go to their heads, and just came out and dismissed a team they should have.
Yeah, I thought the really big takeaway was week one. I thought the defense was the story, right? The defense dominated Carolina and 6 sacks, 3 interceptions, all the things they did. Was that an emotional high, or was this a good defense? And I thought against Middle Tennessee, it looked like, hey, this is a good defense. Exactly what you're saying, right? Like this defense was too good for Middle Tennessee to do anything against. So come out, do your job, and this game is never really going to be in doubt. And I think that's what the defense provided. And I think that's the reason, if you're a Tech fan who thinks, hey, this team could win the division, the fact that that defense, if they're going to play 12 games at a high level, I really like Virginia Tech. If they're going to play 8 games at a high level and 4 meh, it certainly becomes a bigger question, especially depending on when the meh shows up, right? The meh shows up
Yes.
against the wrong opponent. It's a big problem. You also mentioned the Burmeister injury scare, and David, there was serious injury news out of that game, although they didn't know it. It didn't sound like, at least on game day. James Mitchell, the incredibly talented, versatile tight end for the Hokies, he is undergoing right knee surgery, season ending. He's a guy who people thought might bolt last year for the NFL. He chose to come back. He wanted to end on a better note, wins and losses wise. This is a huge loss for Tech, isn't it?
Yes, most certainly is. I mean, and look, the Hokies do have some depth at tight end with Nick Gallo and Drake Dulius, but they don't have James Mitchell's skill set. Not even if you could somehow morph the two, they just don't. I mean, this young man, he is a Sunday caliber talent. We saw it in the opener against Carolina. Whether that pass was intended for him in the end zone or Tavion Robinson, he went up there and it was his. He
Yep.
considered it his, and nobody else was going to get it. And considering that the part of the game it was in, Trey Turner had just dropped what looked like an easy touchdown pass. That was arguably as big a play as the offense made all day, and on jet sweeps, and he was a danger there, and you could split him wide, you could put him in the slot, you could line him up as a traditional tight end. I'm not, other than Burmeister, I'm not sure there's an injury that would have hurt more on the offensive side.
Certainly at the skill positions, right? I mean, I think losing Brock Hoffman on the offensive line would be on par. But your point is a really good one, because I think that Virginia Tech's offense is largely built around the versatility of Mitchell, Blackshear, the athleticism of Burmeister. I think there's a way they play in terms of not having to substitute, not tipping plays by personnel, because Blackshear can play receiver. He can catch out of the backfield. You mentioned all the things Mitchell can do. That's what you don't replace. And what I'm curious to see going forward now, and we're about to talk about this game, I'm curious to see if it changes their offensive identity, because they're no longer going to be the group that can kind of run anything out of any personnel. If Mitchell's out, it changes things up, and a tight end is going to be a more of a conventional tight end. I think they can still be really good offensively, David, but I think it changes their identity to not have him available, and it may show up this week, because what do we make of this matchup with the Mountaineers?
Well, Hokies are 3-point underdogs.
Surprised me.
Yeah, we'll get to another very surprising line in a little bit, at least in my mind. But West Virginia started the year with a road loss against Maryland, tight game. Arguably, the Mountaineers should have won, but had turnover issues. And then last week, they're playing LIU, Long Island University, which is an FCS fledgling, and it was 66-0. I don't know that you can take anything from that, except perhaps because this is hard to do no matter who you're playing. The Mountaineers did take a kick 98 yards to the house. So if nothing else, that gives James Shebest and Virginia Tech special teams something to think about.
They certainly know what the kick return is supposed to look like, because it was executed exactly the way they probably execute it in practice and against air, with all due respect to LIU, of course. Yeah, I'm interested. I thought that Virginia Tech would be favored in this one. Maybe not big favorite, but I thought 4 or 5 points the way their defense is played. But first road test, maybe that factors in. We talked about the environment in Morgantown. Maybe that's what Vegas is kind of looking at.
It's got to be, because otherwise I don't see why you make West Virginia a 3-point favorite. They're having big time trouble running the ball. They only average 3.2 yards a carry. We mentioned the turnovers. They've done some nice things in the passing game, but they're not overwhelming anyone there either.
Yeah, well, you and I have a pretty good handle on the football stuff, but Aaron McFarling's the master when it comes to the line. So we'll get into that with him a little later in today's show and see what he's thinking. But it is Virginia Tech, West Virginia. It is a rivalry. It's a game that I think a lot of people wish was a regular on the schedule, and that brings us to this week's edition of Who You Got.
Thank you, Mike. And we're going to start with you on this question on Who You Got. Alliance member or not, what non-conference team would you like to see on Virginia Tech's schedule every year? Go ahead, Mike.
Dean, I wish you had a boo track for because people will boo me for this answer. Mine is purely selfish, purely personal. I'd love to see Rutgers come back. I'd love to see Rutgers come back because it's my alma mater, because I enjoyed those Big East games. I'd love to see Rutgers come back for no other reason than to have Frank Beamer tell the story of the wild shootout game that his team had with the Scarlet Knights. So yeah, it isn't the answer that most fans would probably go for, but sign me up for Rutgers and Virginia Tech every year.
All right. So David, while they're booing Mike, go ahead and give me
and they're throwing batteries at him. Yeah. They are not just booing him. Clearly, the answer for Virginia Tech faithful would be West Virginia. I would caution against ever scheduling someone every year in the non-conference just because it takes away flexibility. But if pressed, I would go a little different too. And I would say, and this is a team that I don't believe Virginia Tech has ever played and has certainly never visited Lane Stadium. But given the history of Virginia Tech, not football, but the institution, I would love to see the Hokies play Army West Point.
Yes. And what a great experience it is anytime you go there, anytime you play Army. That's a great answer, David.
Yeah, no, it's and actually it just popped into my head. I've been to Army and seen a game there. I actually shadowed one of its football players for several days, went to mess, went to class, and just saw kind of the life of a cadet football player. And just given the ROTC and all it means at Virginia Tech, I think the Hokies and the Black Knights of the Hudson would be a great rivalry.
Now, maybe somebody will be listening and they'll get that done, at least for an occasional game, if it doesn't have to be an annual one. Speaking of annual games and ones that have been played many, many, many years now, and as many, I think, as anybody in the ACC, if I'm not mistaken, UVA and North Carolina. And Virginia's won the last 4. They've won both games since Mack Brown took over. Mack Brown said this week that Virginia's been the more physical team in his 2 meetings with them, that they've out-toughed his team. Who's defensive end Mandy Alonso? Going back to our opening, he might have given the Tar Heels some of that old bulletin board material this week when I asked him about the series with North Carolina.
From UNC, they always try and come physical, but what Mendenhall has been saying the past 4 years is that it's our culture versus theirs. Like, we're gonna go harder, longer, each play, and like the whole game, than they will. And even if they come out swinging, like, we just have to be able to sustain it, and we know that they can't sustain it because the past 4 years they haven't been able to.
Oh boy, David. I know we said that bulletin board material can be overrated, but that sounds like the kind of thing that Mac Brown reads his team on Tuesday and reminds them of as the third quarter ends Saturday night. Like, hey, these guys don't think you can finish. What did you make of those comments?
How about Mandy Alonso throwing Bronco under the bus? Right?
Drag your coach into it.
Yes, like any good journalist, Mandy attributed that quote not to anonymous sources. So that was
Coach said blank.
Yes, not even a coach. It's not even open to interpretation. It's not Robert and it's not Nick Howell. It's Bronco Mendenhall.
Yeah, and there was another moment, and now I can't remember if it was Chris Glazer or Mandy Alonso, where the player said, Coach brought up his personal record against Mac Brown, being 3-1, going back to the BYU, Texas days. So interesting insight into the mind of Bronco Mendenhall from his players there.
No doubt. And Mike, let's not forget, Mac Brown is 3-9 in his career against UVA. And we talked about how the Cavaliers have won 4 in a row in this series. And you mentioned the historical nature of it. This is the 103rd consecutive season that the Tar Heels and Cavaliers have met. And the only series in the country that is longer on a continuous basis is Minnesota-Wisconsin. Now, if we could only get a trophy as cool as Paul Bunyan's axe,
right,
for this game. But no, I think it's a fascinating game. Carolina is still ranked despite the season opening loss in Blacksburg. And Virginia has not beaten a top 25 team on the road, Mike, since 2011 at Florida State.
Now, this Virginia team, David, 2-0, and they've outscored their opponents, William and Mary in Illinois, 85-14. Are we ready to take them seriously, or do we want to wait and see what happens Saturday before we answer that question, maybe?
Oh, I think it's always wise to get as much information as you can, but before leaping to conclusions. But it's impossible. And again, we referenced the betting line on Virginia Tech and West Virginia. Mike, we've seen Carolina in person, you and I. We've seen Virginia in person. We're not experts. We're not football coaches. But how on God's green earth are the Tar Heels 9-point favorites?
Yeah, David, if I had said to you, the line is out and one team is a 9-point favorite, because I think that number's too big either way.
Yes.
But if I said to you, one team is a 9-point favorite, who would you have said?
Well, because the game's in Chapel Hill, I would have said Carolina, and because they're ranked, because venue matters to Vegas for I don't know how many points it traditionally is. So there was no way Virginia was going to be a 9-point road fave against a ranked opponent. No way. But still, the number to me seems, like you said, way too big for either side.
David, this 4-game win streak here for Virginia, everyone's been decided by 10 points or less, but 3 of them have been decided by a touchdown or less. Yeah. Last year was 3 points. So, I don't know, nine for a Virginia team playing really well. That seems, again, we'll ask Mr. McFarling, the expert, coming up, but that number seemed out of whack to me. David, Brennan Armstrong, we've played 2 games, 2 weeks of football in the ACC, and he's been the quarterback or the co-quarterback of the week twice now. How impressed are we with Brennan Armstrong?
Really? I mean, he's and the crazy thing is, those first, 3 series against William and Mary, he was, and I think he'd be the first to tell you, he was bad.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't getting anything done. He had a couple ill-advised throws. He just seemed off. But then since, he has been dialed in. The crazy, he was so hot on the first 2 series against Illinois on Saturday that on the first play of the third series, he completed a 23-yard pass to Keaton Thompson, and that lowered his passer rating. I mean,
that's ridiculous. It's
right.
a crazy stat. That's a great stat.
I mean, that's how scorching he was. And he's completing over 70% of his passes. Now, granted, some of them are those little flips on end arounds or whatever you want to call them, that because they're forward, they count as a pass rather than a lateral. But still, he's been incredibly active.
Yeah, I've been really impressed. Arm strength just seems better. I know they were always big on his arm strength. It seems better this year. His accuracy, the touch on the shorter passes. You mentioned the feel on some of those flips, which are not as easy as they look. He just seems very comfortable, and he seems, going into the year, David, we said, if Brennan Armstrong takes a big step forward and the secondary is better, I think Virginia could have a better season than people are expecting. 2 weeks in, David, I've seen both of those things get checked off in the right column for Virginia.
Absolutely. No question. I mean, Illinois was just, it was helpless on both sides. Mike, that score could have been a lot worse. I mean, Virginia turned it over in the fourth quarter twice in Illinois territory and also missed 2 field goals.
Yeah. It's I actually spent some time with the place kicker today to ask about those, but you're right. I mean, that game never felt competitive, and we'll see what Illinois is. They opened eyes with the win over Nebraska, and then they shut a lot of eyes the next week with the loss to UTSA. But we'll see what the season holds for them. But they are a Power 5 opponent, right? Like they should be capable enough to compete, and they could not compete with Virginia. How about North Carolina? Because obviously, big win score-wise this past week against Georgia State to try to get back on track after opening with the loss to the Hokies. Do we think the team we saw in Blacksburg is the team we're going to see Saturday night? Do we think the team that rickrolled Georgia State is the team we're going to see Saturday night? Or the more logical answer, do we think it's probably somewhere in between?
Let's side on the logic there. I would think somewhere in between. But how about Sam Howell with $104 rushing?
Yeah.
The other night against Georgia State, including, I think it was a 60-some-odd yard touchdown run. Yep. That adds a dimension that Carolina didn't need last year with Javonte Williams and Michael Carter. So we'll see if that part of the Tar Heels offense continues to emerge. They're going to make some plays. I mean, Sam Howell's too good, and Josh Downs and Brown, they've got some weapons. They're going to be okay on offense. It's just a matter of if they have enough against a defense that, again, through 2 weeks, looks markedly better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I talked to Anthony Johnson today, the UVA corner that transferred from Louisville, and we asked him about those rushing yards and those big plays from Sam Howell. And while being very respectful of that ability, he said, he feels like Carolina didn't have a lot of other places to go. And so Sam Howell was in the position to have to make plays with his legs that, you're right, a year ago, there was no need. He was surrounded by weapons. But talking to Phil Longo and talking to Mac Brown this week, they feel like their receivers, Downs has been good in the slot from the start, but they feel like their outside receivers are coming along, and they're getting a little closer, at least in the throw game, to being where they want to be and to having the kind of weaponry they had a year ago.
It certainly appeared to be on Saturday. And they liked the way those receivers played in the bowl against Texas A&M, mm-hmm. and they were really encouraged and thought that progress continued through training camp. Just hit kind of a roadblock in Blacksburg, which, hey, the Hokies may be a roadblock for a lot of folks.
Yeah, well, it's certainly going to be one of those where revisionist, or I don't know if revisionist, but looking back, it'll all make a lot more sense, right? Like maybe Carolina wasn't good, maybe Virginia Tech was the class of the Coastal, maybe Tech and UVA are 1 and 2, but for week 3, there's still, I think, more questions we have than answers. And joining us now to help you direct your betting action this college football weekend, our good friend, the outstanding columnist from the Roanoke Times, Aaron McFarling. Aaron, how are you?
I'm great, Mike. All right, my This Week in Gambling is now 3-0 against the spread. That's always a good way to start things. And then, of course, underdogs won 8 of the 14 NFL games straight up yesterday. So we're taping this on Monday. So that's always a good thing for me when moneyline dogs are cashing.
Yeah, and if you've been following Aaron's betting advice, it means you're probably listening to this podcast from your new beach house somewhere tropical. So congratulations to you, and it was smart on taking Aaron's advice. And into the puppy chow we go, and let's start though with the two Commonwealth teams, and let's start with Virginia Tech playing at West Virginia. I think the fan and media consensus is that, hey, Virginia Tech might be for real, and then here comes the line, and I'm looking at West Virginia as a 3-point favorite. Aaron, what do you make of that one?
I am with the odds makers here. I'm going to take West Virginia in this game, and I know my readers aren't going to love hearing that, but I think there's probably some trepidation in a lot of their minds too about what's going to happen with these Hokies going on their first road trip, a real road trip with actual fans, a packed house since 2019. And this is their only road game they're playing in their first 7. I think it sets up that they're going to get beat here, actually. I think it's going to be a fun one. I watched that entire West Virginia-Maryland game. I am a Maryland alum, so I was watching it. I also might have had a small short-term investment in it as well. But, there's a lot of speed on that West Virginia team. They do a lot of things in space. Tackling is going to be paramount for Virginia Tech. They're certainly more prepared this year to tackle in space than they were last year. There's no question about that. But I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. What I think the value here is on the over 50.5. I think there's going to be more points than that. The return game can give points for West Virginia. I see 35-28 West Virginia here. I don't think it's going to damage. Sure, it'll hurt in the rankings and everything else for the Hokies, but I don't think it's going to wreck their season by any stretch. They've got the Coastal well within their sights as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about the way their schedule shapes up, and fans and probably people making at least casual bets are going to be super into the West Virginia game, the Notre Dame game. But as you point out, that really has no impact on whether or not they win the Coastal and go to the ACC title game. And another team that's in the hunt for that ACC Coastal title, well, really two of them, Virginia and North Carolina. North Carolina opened with the loss to Tech. Virginia certainly looked really impressive their first 2 games. They're going to Chapel Hill Saturday night as a 9-point underdog. What do you make of that one?
Yeah, I look at that line. I think it's too many, and part of the reason is a lot of the trends are heading in the Cavaliers' direction. At least when it comes to covering the spread. The Cavaliers battle you, man. They've covered in 7 of their past 8 games overall. Each of the past 4 meetings with UNC, they've covered the spread. And the Tar Heels are only 1-4 against the spread in their last 5 home games. That's a lot of trends that like Virginia. I still like Carolina to win this game, but I think it's closer than 9. I'm going to say North Carolina 35, Virginia 30.
I think 3 of the last 4 have been decided by a touchdown or less. So history is certainly on your side. Another thing I wanted to ask you, Aaron, we've seen a number of injuries around the ACC, some really big name players, including James Mitchell, the tight end at Virginia Tech. How quickly does Vegas react, and how quickly does a line move, if it does at all, when an important player is injured?
Yeah, it certainly is a bigger deal when it's a quarterback. It's a name person that everybody knows. Remember, these are public perception moves that you're going to see. If it had been Burmeister, then I think it would have moved more significantly than it did. I think we've seen a half a point uptick for West Virginia. I tend to not ignore injuries. Injuries are a big part of every sport, of course, but I try not to overreact too much to them. The Hokies have won 2 games with James Mitchell playing, not the major role that he has in years past. And yeah, certainly you'd love to have him out there. And I hate it for him. He's just such an impressive young man in every way, both on the field and off of it. But, Vegas, for a receiver, a tight end, those things aren't going to really jack the line one way or the other as much as a quarterback would.
Interesting stuff. Well, this segment is called Amax Puppy Chow, so let's look at an underdog. You got one on the board. You got a bet on the board that you really like.
Yeah, I'm going to take the Hoosiers. Indiana's playing Cincinnati at home, and they're catching 3.5. And the Hoosiers really, they came in with some hype. They were ranked 17th coming into the season, and then they got their doors blown off at Iowa in that first game. And as we've come to find out, Iowa's pretty darn good. What they did to Iowa State this past week. I think I'm willing to give the Hoosiers a mulligan here. Cincinnati's been vulnerable as a road favorite. They're 2-5 in their last against the spread in their past 7 games as a road favorite. And, the Hoosiers have historically, that Iowa game notwithstanding, they've done a good job punching above their weight class. They've covered in 5 of their past 6 as a dog and 13 of their past 16 against teams with winning records. So, when the game is a 3.5 point spread, if you like the 3.5, you probably like them to win too. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the trigger on Indiana 27, Cincinnati 23.
Well, you heard it here first. And if you haven't already got your bets down, follow along. And like I said, you can join some of your listening brethren on the beach next week when you join them in retirement, thanks to Aaron's tips. So, Aaron, nice job. Always great to talk to you.
Same here, Mike. Good luck, everyone. Let's hope to keep it going.
Well, David, James Mitchell wasn't the only bad injury news in the conference. There were a number of significant injuries, and the kind of injuries, David, that can really affect things here going down the rest of the way of the season.
It was a really, really dark Monday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, James Mitchell, Phil Jurkovec, the starting quarterback at Boston College, is done perhaps for the year, but certainly long term with a hand injury. Peyton Wilson at NC State, I think unquestionably the best linebacker in the conference. He's done with a shoulder issue. Cyrus Fagan, one of the Wolfpack safeties, he's out. Day Hollins, not a starter, but a key corner for North Carolina. He's done for the year. I mean, even to the point where BC announced that its 2-year starter at place kicker is now done. And, we don't tend to look at kickers, but this is a guy who was 16 for 20 on field goals last year. And forgive me, while I know BC's depth chart at quarterback and Dennis Grosel, who's going to replace Phil Jurkovec, has 8 career starts. And, oh, by the way, threw for 500 plus yards at Charlottesville last season. I do not know who BC's backup kicker is or if he is any good.
David, the reality is, I don't know if BC knows who their backup kicker or if he's, because there are a lot of teams that, it's funny, kickers are a lot like, in that regard, sometimes offensive linemen or umpires in baseball, you notice them when they go bad or you notice them if they go missing. But it was just a brutal, and it's the thing that, I don't know, it's the thing I hate about this job and that I hate about college sports. I hate season-ending injuries. I hate how they affect kids like James Mitchell, who came back and wanted to play another year in college and is such from our experience, such a good guy, really easy to talk to, really easygoing. You could tell he really just enjoys the experience of being a college football player. I hate that's been taken away from him, through no fault of his own. And then we talked about how that's going to impact Virginia Tech's offense. And I think the injury at NC State is going to disrupt their vision of their defense, right? It's not plug and play. It's not, okay, who do you put in? And I know they say those things, right? They always say next man up, but you change the construct and the vision of your defense when your all-American caliber inside linebacker is no longer in that spot. You just have to. I hate that part of college athletics.
No doubt. And Mike, you mentioned how James Mitchell is held in such high regard among his teammates and his coaches. It's earlier in the season, but it reminds me last year of Charles Snow at UVA, a young man who decided to come back, who represented the institution, the team, his family in such good ways. And then, again, through sheer fate, has it all end in one play.
Just brutal. Speaking of brutal, week 1 for the ACC was pretty brutal. Week 2, David, The nice thing about the schedule here and the way they've done it. You've always got a chance to kind of redeem yourself. They split with the Big Ten, right? Rutgers beat Syracuse, but Virginia roughed up Illinois. They split with the SEC because Pittsburgh did win it at Tennessee, whereas NC State, was much less successful with Mississippi
Right, that
State.
was lifeless. For a team that everyone was kind of on, to maybe challenge Clemson, but finish second in the Atlantic. They gave up an opening kickoff return for a touchdown and didn't look like they had it in them for the next 59 minutes and change.
David, that would be the game I think you and I would be banging on and harping on and saying, this is the weak link. This is what makes the ACC look bad. But hey, guess who got the Wolfpack off the hook? Florida State, losing at home to Jacksonville State, 2017, in maybe one of the most bizarre finishes I've ever seen, because Jacksonville State scores on the last play of the game. They don't throw a Hail Mary. They throw essentially a deep route, catch it, and Florida State defense just seems disinterested in making the tackle, and the gun goes off. 20-17 Jacksonville State. That's as bad a loss as the conference had this week or this season or in a while. What do we make of the mess in Tallahassee?
59 yards on just a simple go route against an FCS team. It's indefensible. Pun very much intended. It can't happen. That's coaching. That's preparation. That's a whole lot of things. And the schedule does not get any easier for the Seminoles. Everybody after the overtime loss, the opening weekend to Notre Dame, and how much the Noles fought, and Mackenzie Milton's comeback, and what a great atmosphere it was at Doak Campbell. Just all of it flushed within 10 seconds, however long that it took.
So week one, we said, okay, bad look for the ACC, but let's not overreact. Now we've got 2 weeks in the book, and we're not we're not overwhelmed, overly impressed. What are we making of the ACC, David?
Maybe Pitt's pretty good.
Yeah.
Maybe the Hokies and Cavaliers are pretty darn good. We're about to. Maybe Carolina's still pretty good. We'll find out. Miami certainly didn't light anything on fire. The Hurricanes were very fortunate to get by Appalachian State. Not as fortunate as the Feline, who fell from the upper deck. And
how about that? How about that? If you haven't seen this, go look this clip up on YouTube or wherever you get your ridiculous videos these days. But yeah, a cat. And I said to my wife, I said, how did the cat get into the upper deck of the stadium? And
right.
She kind of looked at me, and we have a cat here at the house, Hampton, and she said, cats get in everywhere. And that's a good point. But this cat's essentially hanging from the banner, right? Up there in the stadium, and drops. David, do we know how far that cat dropped?
It was, let's put it this way. If they hadn't caught him in the flag, it would have been really messy.
Yes. And in true cat form, and I'm not trying to bang on cats here, but in true cat form, he was not appreciative in the least. That cat wanted away from those people, and I don't blame him. I'm sure that was traumatic, but it was very cat the way they saved his life, and he looked like he couldn't wait to just be done with them.
And that was the highlight of that game.
Yeah. If you're Miami, you're hoping that's the only thing anybody's talking about from that one. Well, there are some more chances, right? I said this. The schedule gives you more chances. Miami, they get another chance. They got Michigan State, who I think people are starting to realize is pretty decent this year. Duke Northwestern, that might be of interest to the new ACC commissioner. Those are the Big Ten matchups. We talked about Tech and West Virginia with the Big 12. And speaking of the Big 12, they've got some more teams coming their way. David, what we talked about, who makes sense, who doesn't, financial reasons. What do you think of the invites going out from the Big 12?
I think they made the right decisions, Mike. Yeah. And not only did they make the correct decisions, they made them quickly.
Sure did.
And they needed to, because if allowed to fester, this was not going to end well for the Big 12. They had to respond and counter to losing Texas, and Oklahoma. Now, Houston, Cincinnati, UCF, and BYU are not Texas and Oklahoma. No one is saying they are, but they were about as good a football brands as you could have found to add to a Power Five conference. I don't know where else you could have turned.
No, absolutely. And we talked about this when we talked about Notre Dame, but I like Houston because of the market, right? It's a good program. It's a respectable program. It's a school that's putting more in, and they get you into a valuable area there in the Houston television market. The same thing when you're thinking about Cincinnati. No, of course they're not Ohio State. We get that. But that's a really good program, having a really good season this year and high expectations. But business-wise, gets you in a good market. I think Central Florida does too. BYU, that's probably more about the tradition of the program and the quality of the program. But yeah, I thought this was, I want to say a home run for the Big 12 in that it was the best they could do. I think it was more, they took a pitch on the outside part of the plate and slapped it into right field, right? Like they did all they could do in the situation. I thought they did the most with their situation, and these were the right additions.
Yeah, I wouldn't shortchange BYU, and I'm not just trying to suck up to Bronco Mendenhall and most of his coaches. That is a brand with a large fan base around the country because of the church affiliation. And you look at some TV ratings, BYU brings eyeballs. So I think that was a really, really wise addition and inclusion by the Big 12.
Yeah, so 4 pickups that they might not jump off the page, but they do potentially add revenue and add television viewers, which is really, sadly in some ways, what it's all about. It also brings us to this week's edition of Take It or Leave It.
Thank you, Mike. And David, this time we're going to start with you. Now that there's an unsigned alliance and the Big 12 seems to have found its replacement teams, there won't be any more Power 5 conference realignments for the next 3 years. So let's take it or leave it with David.
I will very hesitantly take it with the one caveat of if the college football playoff expansion to 12 teams is derailed and somehow Notre Dame's playoff access is compromised by, say, an 8-team model that includes 5 or 6 automatic bids, then I think you could very well see Notre Dame heading to the ACC and then perhaps maybe even the ACC adding one more.
Okay, good point. Mike?
David, remind me, have you seen a copy yet of the signed agreement for the alliance? No, you haven't. I haven't either because there isn't one. I'm going to leave it because all of this is being done. All of the stability that is coming to college football is coming in the form of handshakes from, quite bluntly, a group of people, a profession of people who have proven in the past that they'll do what's in the best interest for their schools and leagues, and in some ways rightfully so. I'm going to leave it because I think it's a fool's errand to predict what's going to happen. And it's hard to imagine going 3 years without something coming apart, coming undone. David mentioned the implications of the college football playoff. That's the big one, right? And where they're headed with a new TV deal. I'm going to leave it because unless I see a signed document that says the alliance isn't going to pilfer from each other, I'm not even convinced that we won't see movement within that group, let alone the entire Power Five. So I've got to leave it. It does bring up another question, though, David. We stuck the word Power Five in the question, but I think it's pretty obvious that change is coming to the remaining leagues, right? To the group of 6. What do you see the future there?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I mean, the AAC has come out and been very frank and said, with the loss of UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston, that league is on the is in the market to add some teams. And there's got to be some geographic sense brought to conferences such as CUSA and the Sun Belt. They're just scattered all over, and there needs to be some adjustments there. And I wonder still, Mike, it's my alma mater and a school you covered for a long, long time, if this might create an opportunity for James Madison to leave FCS and elevate to the FBS.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of bad feeling from West Virginia fans over Tech leaving them. That's at JMU when it comes to ODU, because ODU restarted its program, got good at FCS football, and then bolted for FBS really quickly. And it's something JMU's been talking about for years. I mean, the whole decade I spent in Harrisonburg, it was always a major topic. I don't know that it always made sense for JMU to jump to FBS. I think now more than ever, maybe it does. With some of the other moves, with some of the teams that have been in and out of the conference, just the general viability of the FCS level, I think now it's starting to make sense. So I'm intrigued by them. I'm intrigued by another school that I think a lot of times the conferences, even Group of Six, were reluctant to touch because maybe of some politics and some off the field stuff. David, what happens to Liberty? Does this open the door for more moves for Liberty?
Mike, there's no maybe about it. They're hesitant to touch Liberty absolutely because of politics. It's just a fact of life, and no matter what side of the aisle you happen to be on, there's no denying that. And whether that's right or wrong is a debate for another day. But that has been the issue. Whether recent changes at the institution have eased those concerns, I do not know. But there's no question that Liberty invests an awful lot of money and manpower in its athletics program. All you have to do is drive past the campus. It's breathtaking they've done from a facilities standpoint. And oh, by the way, they had a heck of a football season last year. And but for a blocked field goal at North Carolina State, might have been undefeated.
Yeah, and they may be on their way to another big season this year. They've got basically everybody back there. And yeah, I think if you take the politics out of it, Liberty's a slam dunk. You can't do that. Like you, I thought maybe they were headed in a direction that they would become more palatable. And then I did read all the headlines this past week with the their stance on the vaccine and requirements and the outbreak that they've then dealt with. And it's just a reminder that it's a little trickier than just, hey, this place has got great facilities. They're really invested. Let's add them. There's a little more to it. But yeah, we might be headed to a future where Liberty, JMU, ODU, maybe they all end up in the same place. And I think for Virginia and for Olympic sports, that all would make a lot of sense.
A ton of sense. And I know some athletic directors at some smaller schools around the Commonwealth who would love to make that happen.
Sure would be easing on their budgets if their softball teams and tennis teams weren't traveling, as you mentioned, with some of these conferences out to El Paso and wherever else when they could be playing in quality programs here within the state. I think that would be good for everyone. Well, thanks for listening. You can subscribe to Teel and Barber on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your favorite pods. And please consider supporting local journalism with an online subscription to the TD. You can find special promotional offers available at richmond.com. Today's show was produced by Dean Hoffmeyer. Teel and Barber is a podcast of the Richmond Times-Dispatch and richmond.com. For David Teel, I'm Mike Barber. Thanks for listening. Be healthy and safe, and please join David and me again next time.